everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk Markets with Dave Lauer. I'm Pink, and I'm here with our special guest today to talk about a whole bunch of acronyms, Alexandra Damsker. Alexandra, how are you doing? You broke your foot earlier this week, so I just want to say thank you for being here and kind of pushing through. You're a real champ.
Well, thank you. As long as you're noting my trooperishness, that's really all that matters. Everybody has to just note how I'm being so strong.
You are. Well, you're the Tsarina of crypto, right?
I am.
So
I am. That's my formal title. I appreciate that. Yeah, the Tsarina, and I have a broken foot. So
it's an honor to have you join us.
It really is, isn't it?
Yeah. I know it's an honor. You're darn right.
Well, 2 weeks ago, we dipped our toe into the Ripple decision. And here's the ultra-fast recap. The U.S. District Court of Southern New York ruled that Ripple's XRP token was a security when being sold to institutional investors, but not a security when being sold to everyday investors. And obviously, there's more to it, but here's the main thing. For those seeking clarity on the future of crypto regulation, this was the exact opposite. So by provide something of an inconclusive ruling, court revealed an important truth that we don't yet have the regulatory regime or legal mechanisms needed to properly regulate this rapidly innovating space. So in its suit against Ripple, the SEC did take a swing at it. We'd say that the result was probably a foul ball, and they're not out yet, but they're definitely down in the count. So now Congress has stepped up to the plate, and it's just an entire mess. So that's what we're here to talk about today. Dave, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and so I definitely appreciate Alexandra joining us to have an actual expert on these issues. And, I think you had the XRP decision, which, as I said in the previous podcast, I thought was very strange, very confusing. And now there's been another decision this week that came out from Judge Rakoff. I hope I said that right. In the same district, in which he explicitly rejected the logic of some of the logic of the Ripple decision with Luna and Terra. And I believe, Alexandra, I'm sure you can speak to this better than I can, but I believe he said he recognizes the token is not per se a security, but that once it's been offered and sold as a security, that's pretty much it. That, it's I thought his analogy was actually really good, that in Howie, what we saw was, the Orange Grove itself wasn't a security, but the investment contract that led to securitization was, and therefore once a security, I don't know, always a security, but at that point it becomes maybe a higher bar to be deemed not a security. Is that your read of what Rakoff said?
Well, yes and no. Here's what I thought, more was the case. This was really more a statement that, so there of the three areas in XRP, and I mean, the XRP army already hates me. Woo, props to them. Get in line, man.
Right? Yeah. You have opinions in finance online. Forget about it. You're hated. Right?
I know, exactly. Any opinion is not welcome. But here's what happened. So with XRP, we had basically these three areas. One with the institutional investors, where it is a security. And they said, of course, it's a security. It was marketed as a security. There's all this, there were blogs, there were interviews, there were pamphlets, all this stuff. There's no mistaking the fact that it's a security. Then there were these other two areas, the programmatic sales, which were sales on a marketplace, like people bought it off of an exchange.
Yeah.
And then the other ones that were called other distributions. And the problem here is that the reasoning is just bad law. It's really bad. Agreed. And unfortunately—
Not a lawyer, of course, but totally agree.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of problems in this. The first one is that XRP failed to use two of the best arguments that they had in this entire case. They haven't used them at all, and we'll get to that if you want. But so those arguments weren't used. Of the arguments that were used, Torres in this one gave arguments that were completely unfounded in supporting her decision here. The programmatic arguments were basically saying that, well, For the people who bought off an exchange, they didn't know if they bought from Ripple or from a secondary shareholder. And if you don't know if you bought from Ripple, then you don't know if you bought a security. But who the seller is completely irrelevant to whether or not it's a security.
Right.
That is not something that's supportable. So no,
Especially
there's no
something
way.
fungible. I mean, the whole thing, like you have exchanges where you're buying stock from people. It's not from the issuer. It doesn't make it not a security.
Exactly.
That part of the decision was so confusing to me. And then one thing that I think she tried to make this point, which is that, like the buyers of the programmatic buyers that didn't have an expectation that they would profit from the efforts of others.
Yeah.
And I was like, have you ever met someone buying crypto? Like that's the only reason they buy it.
I thought this was the most insulting thing. She said that they were not sophisticated, so there's no way they would have known. So all of the information that the institutional investors had were in the public sphere, right?
Exactly.
They had access to blogs, they had access to interviews and pamphlets. But retail investors, she literally says they could not have known that meant that this was a security and it would have, it was meant to indicate that it would be profitable, right? So,
and I can tell you, look, this is anecdotal, but as someone who actually bought XRP on an exchange during that period, it's crazy to think that people who were buying it weren't looking at all that material. It's absurd.
It is. It's so insulting to think, and this is one of the reasons why people still abide by the stupid accredited investor rule. They think that there's some fundamental difference between people who are accredited and people who are not, and there isn't. It's people who are unaccredited can read. They're literate. They have access to information. It's the craziest thing, right? So
they can read.
I know, and I'm shocked that people weren't incredibly offended by this, but this was, so that is just not supportable. That is one of the things where people say, well, I don't know if it'll be appealed. Yes, it'll be appealed. There's no way that can stand. Nobody is going to use that and apply that, because there's no way you could actually say first that investors that have available information are not, oh no, they're too dumb to look at available information. And that basically says that all prospectuses are useless.
Right. And there's, exactly. And there's the other side of this, which we did get into in the podcast, but I would be interested in your opinion, is that it actually has the sort of intent of the security laws completely backwards, right? Like the institutional investors and sophisticated investors are generally allowed to sort of opt out of the security law protection and framework because they can invest in private offerings, for example, that aren't necessarily registered and governed under that framework. Whereas retail and individual investors are supposed to be the ones who are to be protected by the securities laws. And it felt like Judge Torres just got it completely backwards from that perspective.
It totally. And this is one of those where I feel like she had an idea in her head of how she wanted it to go and was trying to apply rationale backwards. And unfortunately, here's one of the biggest issues that we have in this space. People don't understand what the regulation is for, right? People don't understand why we even have it or what it's supposed to do. And here's the thing. If there's a company that says, I don't want to register because I don't get to sell my product to retail investors and they don't have access to the kind of profit-making deals that other people have access to, I am on that bus and I'm driving it on Sundays, right? I'm leading that charge, right? I love that. But that's not what we have. We have companies saying, I don't want to register. And why are they saying they don't want to register? It's a combination of things. Well, blockchain is special. Somehow it's not. Our investors don't need it because back to the blockchain is special. Not true. Or because they're saying really what it is they don't want liability. Well, wait a second. That's not my problem. If you don't want liability, you shouldn't do this, right? Or they don't want to pay for the work or do the work. Well, also not my problem. What's that work for? That's for the investors, right? That's for the investors to be protected. You have the right to ask questions, to know what exactly your money is going towards. People feel like the people taking their money are doing them a favor, but really the projects should earn your money,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Your
And
money.
not only should you have that ability, but you should have the protection of laws that ensure that if those companies misrepresent or lie to you, that that you have recourse if that happens.
Exactly. I totally agree.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And that's why I don't generally have problems when they say, we need you to provide information, disclosure information. And that kind of, that's the stuff where I think, okay, good. Like what kind of information? As long as it's not more onerous, it's not harder for the people in blockchain than for other people, right? Like, don't make it harder.
Sure.
Like for payment stable coins, it's like, it's one thing for people that are banks, and then it's like 20 times harder for non-banks, right? I don't want that crap. But if it's like, okay, it's the same thing for everybody, where people say, oh, it's getting just like it is in regular finance. Well, if you're raising funds the way everyone else does, yeah, it looks a lot like regular finance because you're doing the same thing, right?
Right. And you know what? Like, these are tried and true laws over decades, and they've protected people often, not all the time, unfortunately, but there's a reason. I think crypto is really discovering in a lot of ways why the security laws exist and why they are there to protect people.
Exactly. So I don't have a problem with disclosure as long as the disclosure is in line with what all other companies have to do. It shouldn't be worse for us, but it doesn't need to be non-existent for us, right?
Yeah.
It protects the investors, and that's who we're trying to protect. And we have a lot of retail investors, so we have more responsibility than the company. Like, I don't want us to leave the retail investors, right? I love that we attract retail investors because they can't afford and don't have access to opportunities elsewhere.
Isn't that the promise of crypto, though, right? It's supposed to be something that is accessible. It's supposed to break down incumbencies and barriers, and and democratize access to both advanced financial functionality, and allow people to get in on the ground floor of great opportunities, and basically just be a different approach to finance. And what we're seeing instead, in a lot of ways, is we're bringing a lot of the worst parts of finance, and we're not fostering the really innovative and beneficial parts of crypto.
Totally. And the worst part is we're bringing in VCs. We're taking out all of the control, like all the controls that we had around that. So they're like, this is awesome. Of course they think it's awesome. It's like, for them, it's a field day, it's getting more money from people that they didn't get to tap before. So, we need protections. And I know that it's more work for companies, but it's not that much work. And the protection way outweighs the amount of work. Some of the bills that we're looking at right now actually have a very streamlined approach to disclosure, which I think is actually a really good way to approach it. And we can talk about some of those bills, because I think that it's a way to kind of look at a possibility in the future for how we can approach this problem. And one of the bills I think definitely has an edge. We can talk about how we can approach this problem so we can maintain access, and we can still provide, though, the kind of information that people deserve. You deserve to know where your money is going, how much money they're making, so you can compare between projects.
Right.
How well are these projects doing? You can't trust someone who's got just like basically a cat NFT to their name saying we're doing great. Right. That's not enough. You deserve more, right? You deserve more accountability. That's really what a lot of the disclosure is. It isn't about the regulatory agency. It's about accountability to the investors. And it's basically a promise that says, here's where we are, here's what we're doing. If they omit anything or they lie about anything, you can sue them.
Right.
You can sue them, and that's so
right?
important.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, let's talk about that, right? So you've got 4, promising, I would say, or credible pieces of legislation that are kind of in the mix today. Can you talk about those and what they would do, and what you think of them?
Yeah. So we'll talk about so 2 of them are, I think, less credible. One is already passed through a House. And then one has passed through committee. So the first one that would just get out of the way is actually a Defense Act that passed a part of a bill, a Senate bill that was revived, that was a Warren bill. So Warren, Loomis, Gillibrand, or Gillibrand, however you pronounce her name. Apologies to the Gillibrand family.
There's no consensus. It's much like GIF, which there is only one correct way to pronounce it, which is obviously GIF. But for some reason, lots of people think it should be pronounced GIF. So it's silliness, but I believe that she encounters that same kind of thing. So you can't.
Oh, and she says that there's no consensus.
No,
I'm sure in her family, she's like, there's consensus. So, but anyway, so there's one bill that has been revived from 2020, which is the Warren Gillibrand and Loomis bill, and then I think Marshall is the last one on there, and that bill is a Senate bill, and it is essentially a bill that's based on the banking rules, right?
Is that the Responsible Financial Innovation Act?
Yes, I believe that's what it's called. Let me check. I have it on here somewhere. This is the one. It's the Digital Asset Anti-Money Laundering Act. Did they no, I think that they may have renamed it, but it's the Digital Asset Anti-Money Laundering Act.
Okay.
No, the responsible, that's the other one. That's just Gillibrand and Loomis, right? Gotcha. Is the responsible money, the responsible whatever act. That one, that's a different one. Okay. This one is just the one that's called the Digital Asset Anti-Money Laundering Act, and it was a 2022 bill that was originally Warren and Marshall. And it's based on the KYC AML frameworks, right? So it is very heavy on making sure that everything that is connected to crypto is very focused on KYC AML. They're talking wallets, miners, validators, everybody involved has to be basically not anonymous.
Everybody. I think I do remember when that first was proposed last year, or maybe earlier than that. But the crypto industry, if I recall, was really up in arms against that idea. Obviously, it strikes at the heart of some of their notions of autonomy and sovereign, and decentralization, sovereignty. And so, is that still where things stand, or is there a bit more acceptance that actually you do need to combat and address money laundering?
Okay, so here's what happens here is that, so this is combined with a bunch of anti-terrorism rules, right? So this is combined with anti-terrorism and rogue nation stuff, which, by the way, is coming into the forefront of legislation, because remember, if you guys have talked about it, the FATF rules are becoming mandatory for 200 nations, including the U.S. Those are about the travel. I'm sorry?
We have not talked about that, no.
Okay, so that is about the travel rule and making sure that everybody is essentially known parties, right? Everybody is a known party, and it has a lot of different rules. And MICA is the first big law passed in compliance with the FATF rules. Our regulations have to change to this system, and fundamentally, that system is based on a lot of KYC AML and changing the way that we look at assets. Instead of looking at them as, is this a security or not a security? They look at them basically as financial assets and virtual assets, and essentially they classify things according to risk, which isn't actually a terrible thing, right?
Interesting.
And it's a very, like, it doesn't really matter what you call it. It's really just a risk assessment. And honestly, anyone doing a proper risk assessment on any of these projects is a really good thing. So that's one thing there. And then, so that is all coming into play. And that is what initially pushed this, their original bill, this Warren bill forward, right? The Warren Digital Asset Anti-Money Laundering Bill. Okay. Here's what happened like 3 days ago. This national defense bill, right, has nothing to do with crypto. National defense bill just got passed through the Senate. This national defense bill has an amendment in it that was done by Warren Marshall and Loomis and Jilla Gillibrand. And it has this mandatory stablecoin clause in it. It says that here, it says that, let me just look at this quickly. It says that you have to establish standards for crypto. It's going to force KYC AML standards for crypto, especially with respect to payment stablecoins, right? Even though there's another payment stablecoin bill that's circulating. Mm-hmm. And it has to comply with money laundering, right? So it's pulling the language directly from this old 2022 bill that we weren't even looking at anymore. It's pulling the language directly from there, put it into an amendment in this Defense Act, and it's now going after privacy coins and stable coins, right? And there's a little clause in there that says that it could expand into KYC AML for everything, right? And it already passed the Senate because it's just an amendment. So now it's going to the House. Now, did anybody even know this amendment was in there? No. They snuck that crap in. Can you believe that?
I mean, I can believe anything when it comes to DC and, sneaking shit in when nobody's looking. But it's silly that they'll think no one will find out. Obviously, people found out. What's the, where's the crypto industry on this amendment? Are they against it? Are they lobbying against it? Do they have any hope?
I mean, I think right now they're just realizing, what the fuck? I mean, I think that it's one of those things, like we are terrible at organization. Honestly, we need to combine forces and actually pull together a real lobby, and not the crap lobby that we tried to do with the infrastructure bill, where we had the the Bitcoin maxis working against the rest of crypto. That's garbage. Like, honestly, we're like the tiniest family. We can't afford to have Hatfield and McCoy garbage in here. Like we can fight among ourselves.
So you can say that all you want. You'll never convince the maxis on that.
I mean, they can do what they want, but the truth is they need us. We're the growing part, right? Like the rest of crypto is the growing part. So
those are fighting words.
I know. But I'm saying, like, it's fact, right? You go out there and say, like, what is being built out there? Most of it is, like outside the BTC arena. It's all the rest of crypto. So the truth is that they can't win alone. They can't. They want to, but they can't. They tried. They didn't. Let's please just work together, because we don't actually have enough people to win on either side alone, but we have more than enough to win together. So we should just combine forces and make sure that this entire sector can survive, right? Because there's so many people that are trying to attack us. We don't really have enough people to defend ourselves individually. So
what do you think? Okay, let's maybe, instead of going bill by bill, what do you think then is the answer, right? Like, what does victory look like?
So then I think it is actually closer to one of the bills, to the McHenry bill.
Okay.
So there's two other bills, and I'm just going by the people who started them, because the names they change a lot, and I don't really care what the names are. So then there's the Loomis Gillibrand bill. That's the Responsible Money or whatever the hell it is act, whatever they call it.
Responsible Financial Innovation Act.
Yeah. So that one is based primarily on consumer protection.
Mhm.
The problem is that's the wrong approach for crypto, right? That's not really, that's like considering the people who are buying crypto as consumers of it, but that's not really how it works, right? People buy crypto for lots of different reasons and they don't actually even know the reason until they use it. So looking at it from a product perspective is really not a very useful perspective. The McHenry one looks at it more from an investor perspective. Now, that's also not the only way that people purchase crypto or are involved in crypto, but it's a better way. And one of the things that it does that's really remarkable, it does a couple of things that are really good. One is it gives an exemption for all sales of, for project sales up to $75 million. That's enormous, right? In a 12-month period, you sell up to $75 million. Right on. That's great.
It's kind of like a Reg A approach.
A Reg A, right. And it's an exemption. They give you a clear exemption saying, you know what, this much you can sell. It's a high exemption. I imagine that probably won't last, right? They'll probably cut it down, but I could easily see that going to 50. And having a $50 million exemption for projects is a significant exemption to 25 or 50, I imagine. That would actually work. And that because 25 million is traditionally the revenue mark for small business. So I could imagine them saying, okay, 25 million isn't enough of an impact really on general markets. We could say that 25 million would actually be an impact, would actually make enough of an impact so something could grow, but not so much of an impact that it's a widespread, huge project. So I could see that that would actually work. I think it's a pretty cool exemption, and it would be nice for that to apply across the board, not just in crypto projects.
Well, so would it come not just with an exemption, but also with a level of disclosure that's required?
This doesn't specify, doesn't say that there needs to be a level of disclosure. I imagine it would be a form, right? So there'd be a form that you have to fill out. You'd have to identify it. And here's the other thing, though. You can have unaccredited investors, but the unaccredited investors have limitations.
Yeah.
And I love this.
And that's so when we raised money as Irvin Finance, we actually did it under Reg CF. And so, it sounds like a very similar approach, which is to say, you can raise from unaccredited investors. There are restrictions in doing that. There is a level of disclosure that's required. But outside of that, it really opened things up for us. And it was it's the only reason our business exists.
That 75 million, CF is 5 million, right? Yeah. 75 million is an enormous amount. And the ability to have unaccredited investors in there, the idea of having them in and having using a percentage and having it be self-attested,
right?
And having a reasonable standard. That is, I think, a beautiful thing. So I really like that they took the standard there. The requirements are very reasonable. There's some here. Let me actually just check to make sure. The requirements are, there's a few things that you can't be in order to do it, but the disclosure is like minimal, actually. So it's actually, it's super reasonable. So it's basically like operation and management. That's it. So it's actually something that I think is very useful. And then the whole thing is predicated on this idea that once you hit, assuming this is your purpose, right? Once you hit functional and decentralized, and those are terms that are somewhat defined in here. Once you're a functional and decentralized blockchain and you're certified, then you basically, I think it's 180 days later, you have no reporting requirements after that. So the idea that there's a finite point, like nobody starts off decentralized, but if you are aiming towards decentralization and get to a point, and they tell you what they think decentralization is.
So what do they think it is?
So they think, generally speaking, that decentralization is essentially that there's no group that's not a DAO, right? That controls more than 20% of the votes. That nobody has, like, no group has the ability to prevent anybody from being on the chain. Nobody has the ability to block or to block like material changes to the chain. And then you also have these other things where, like, within the last 12 months, you're not allowed to have raised any funds from the public or made any material changes to the code. So you basically have to be entirely algorithmic. And so you can't have like an issuer offering within 12 months. So basically anything that's being offered is either being done programmatically or everything's already been offered. So the tokens are basically just operating through the system somehow algorithmically. And then
that 20% number sounds very gameable to me.
You know, it is. I think it might be. But I think at least it's a starting point, you know, like at least they've got something there. You know, they have a very big definition for related persons and affiliates, and it includes like advisors and people like that. So hold on one second. I hear my kid coming rapidly towards me. Okay. Oh, yay. She went to another room. Okay. So they have a definition that's broad. So theoretically, I think this is what they're thinking, and I don't know because they didn't ask me. Stupid. But what they're thinking, I think, is if they include a very, very broad definition of who is a related, affiliated, etc. party, and they say none of these people can be part of this group. Right. And you can't have a group of people that are 20%. So one person or one person plus any of these people can't be 20%. What the idea is to cut down as many of the possible combinations that could be 20%. Now, the world is very small still in crypto. At this phase, could you really get around this? Sure. I mean, you know, we're still talking like we're only a couple of years from the period of time where there were, you know, 5 groups that controlled 80% of Bitcoin. So of the mining operations of Bitcoin. So, you know, we're not that big. And does everybody really know each other? We're all like within 2 or 3 people of knowing each other. Yeah.
So, and the other side of it is, I mean, you know, again, part of the ethos of crypto is that you are at least pseudonymous, but that, you know, that there is a level of autonomy in, you know, creating and taking, you know, possession of a wallet that makes, I would think, you know, investigating something like this relatively difficult, or at least enforcing something like this relatively difficult.
My concern really was more that you could take somebody who had a big chunk, but cut it into wallets that make it look like they're independent, but they're not.
That's actually what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really more what I think is the big risk. And a lot of that risk comes from the fact that I don't think they have enough people who understand crypto talking to these committees, right? I really don't. I think this is the big issue, because here's what's not covered in these things. NFTs aren't covered. DeFi isn't covered. IP isn't covered. A lot of there are some variations in operations that aren't covered. You know, if you don't have, validators that work the way traditional validators do, if you're moving beyond proof of stake to proof of reputation or things like that, they don't really have something that covers that per se. So, you know, I think we don't have people who understand how many areas of law are really covered in crypto, right? They think it's really just about finance, but it's about so many other areas of law. And those aren't really being talked about. And like right now, one of the big issues that we have for people who are operating, you know, in the space is for creators, your IP isn't covered at all, right? There's nothing that's really protecting it. And, you know, and I was telling everybody, your royalties are only covered by the goodwill of the platform. And they were like, no, it's going to be fine, until Foundation were like, no, I don't really want to pay you guys anymore. And they were like, what the hell? And I said, see, this is what goodwill gets you. It gets you thanks of a grateful nation, which is nothing.
All right, so let's we're running up against it. Let me ask you one last question, and then of course feel free if there's anything we missed to touch on that. But I know, our listeners think about and care about regulatory agencies as crazy as that might be to believe. And there's a lot of controversy in this space about the SEC versus the CFTC. And some of these bills, I believe, would sort of delegate more responsibility to the CFTC than the SEC, which is what the crypto industry certainly wants. And I think probably for maybe two reasons. One, the perception that the CFTC is just, as a regulator, more hands-off than the SEC. But two, quite frankly, the CFTC is much smaller and simply, does not have the resources to have, a large and robust enforcement division like the SEC does. Now, I would probably argue the crypto industry is a bit mistaken on what it might get if the CFTC were to get purview over the asset class, because you would have to increase its funding. But, I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of SEC versus CFTC, and if I've sort of characterized it correctly.
Well, so from the Hill, apparently, one of the big reasons why the CFTC got this push is because, and I know you won't like this, but the word, and I have tried to get this substantiated and has been as much as I can get, the word is that Gary Gensler was asked for technical assistance for these bills, for these two bills, and did not provide it. And one of the reasons why the McHenry bill is dual committee, right? So people think it's bipartisan. It's not bipartisan. It's by committee, meaning two committees did it. And that was the Finance Committee, which is McHenry's committee, oversees the SEC. But he approached the Ag Committee. Agriculture oversees the CFTC. Why? Gensler did not actually help. He was supposed to provide technical support, and there were a number of people who said that he said there's no chance that this is going to happen, and he declined to provide technical assistance. So they went to the Ag Committee, who went to the CFTC, and they provided technical assistance. You provide help, you get rewarded, right? And that is one of the reasons why they are so heavily figured into this, is because they had a seat at the table, they took it. So I think that this is something that, we need to consider is that first, that's unacceptable. If that's true, that's unacceptable that he didn't provide technical assistance. It's literally his job. But for the other reason, I don't think that anybody in Congress is like, let's make it easier by putting it in the CFTC. I guarantee nobody thinks like CFTC is like, they don't think about regulatory agencies, I think, in that way. They're like, who's going to govern this? Who makes the rules? Okay, done. Let's pass this, let's get it the fuck out of committee, right? Like, that's just what they're thinking.
Yeah.
So I don't think that they're thinking this one's easier, that one's harder, this one has Joe on it, that one has George on it. And so which one do we want? Like, I don't think that that's part of the consideration as much. When people think about the CFTC right now, I think what they're thinking is, well, people have been hands off for Bitcoin. And certainly that might be true, because were I the CFTC, I would immediately be jumping on ordinals, because ordinals breach commodity rules, right? That is a problem. And that is what happens when people don't really understand the exclusion under which they operate. And then they start innovating without checking, hey, would this break my exemption? So that's like, when you run a nonprofit, for example, and you're not being taxed on something, the first thing you do when you do anything is, wait, can I do this, or does it make me have to pay taxes now? Right. So this is the thing that everybody working in the Bitcoin sphere should ask is, okay, wait, can I do this? Or is this going to make me someone that now is a security, or now has to deal with other issues? And they're not doing that, and they're creating problems for themselves. And the reason it hasn't bitten them yet is because it takes them a long time regulators a while to understand what is happening here. So there's an idea that the CFTC isn't really going to do anything, but I don't think it's an accurate idea, right?
Yes, I agree with you on that.
Yeah. I don't think
it's
that's right. Remember, Gensler was the head of the CFTC too, right? So you can get anybody that's the head. It really depends on how active they are at that period.
Yeah, that's right. So anything that you wanted to hit on before we finish up? That was really, really interesting, really fascinating take, great perspective.
No, I mean, I hope that was useful and not too like confusing with all the different laws. And I mean, I don't know.
It's hard to not be. It's a confusing space. It's changing quickly. I think you really helped to clear things up. I learned a bunch from this, so I'm sure our listeners did too. So Alexandra Damsker, thank you so much for joining us, making time, toughing it through that broken foot. I know how much that sucks. So I really appreciate the Zarina of crypto joining us on the podcast. And thanks everyone for listening to Let's Talk Markets. As always, please hit that subscribe button, give us a rating, hopefully a good one. Next week, we're going to talk with a law professor from UNLV, Ben Edwards, about a really interesting case that is making its way through the court system, which is FINRA versus Alpine Securities, in which it looks like FINRA could, if this case does continue along this path, there's a chance FINRA could be declared unconstitutional, along with potentially other self-regulatory organizations. Many of you might think that's a great thing, and there's probably a few ways in which it's good, but there's something that has to come after, and that would be a big hole in the financial regulatory framework, and probably mean that the SEC has to take on more responsibility. But we'll talk with Ben Edwards next week about that. And as I have liked to sign off recently, in the words of the late, great Bob Barker, please help control the pet population, have your pets spayed or neutered, and adopt, don't shop. This has been another episode of Let's Talk Markets. Thanks for joining us.